This is the question. Now, is evil of some kind compatible with the existence of God? Yes, that's not in question. But does it really make sense to believe that God is morally perfect and all-powerful if these sorts of things happen? These sorts of things. Now, not all evils are of this kind, but some are, and those are the ones that present a problem. Now, what problem is presented in each of these cases? In the case of the logical argument from evil, we have pretty clearly a rebutter, a rebutting defeater. Right? Because this is an argument from evil that directly attacks our belief that God exists. It takes the form of an argument that God does not exist. The evidential argument from evil, oddly enough, is really not an argument that God does not exist. At least that's not the best way to understand the argument. But if it's not an argument that God does not exist, then what is it? It's an argument that it is unreasonable for you or for me to believe that God exists. Maybe He does. But we couldn't be justified in believing that God exists, even if He does, because of the profusion and character of actual evils in the world. Some things are of such a peculiar kind of evil that it makes it very hard to believe in God, or else we say there's just too much evil. Right? Without saying that this means that God doesn't exist. You see the difference there? Now, is that a rebutting defeater, or is that an undermining defeater? Well, it depends on what it's attacking. If it's attacking the claim that God exists, it's really not a rebutting defeater, because it isn't an argument that God does not exist, is it? So maybe it's a special kind of undermining defeater. It's saying that your evidence that God exists is counterbalanced by this evidence that makes it unlikely that God exists. Now, some people would say this is still a rebutting defeater, but it's not an airtight rebutting defeater. It's a defeater of the claim that God exists, but only because it makes the existence of God unlikely, not because it makes the existence of God impossible. Okay? So you could construe the evidential argument from evil several ways. Or you could say that the evidential argument from evil may not be directly attacking either the claim that God exists or the evidence that God exists, but it attacks the claim that it's reasonable for me to believe that God exists. And in that case, it's a rebutter of my belief that it's reasonable to believe that God exists. Okay? Now, how do we respond to the evidential argument from evil? There really are two main strategies for responding to the evidential argument from evil. There is a third strategy that is especially pertinent to the evidential form of the argument from evil, but it is so special in character that I'm going to save it for a separate discussion. We'll talk about it tonight, but I want to talk first about two general strategies for responding to the evidential argument from evil. Okay? Typically, theists respond by offering what is called a theodicy. A theodicy. Does anybody here have any familiarity with this term? Have any ideas about what a theodicy is? Okay. Sometimes the whole project that we're engaged in tonight, including all the stuff we did talking about the logical argument from evil and everything we've said about the evidential argument and we're about to say, plus a whole bunch of stuff we won't have time to say, is all theodicy. It's trying to reconcile the existence of God with the reality of evil. And that's one way the term has been used. Right? It comes from two Greek terms, theos and dikos. God and righteousness. Right? And you're trying to establish that God is righteous. Right? Doesn't it say in the book of Genesis in rhetorical fashion. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Now, the reason why this is even a question is because there are occasions when we really wonder, due to experiences that we have. But theodicy has a more precise, specialized use than that. And it comes in right here in response to the evidential argument from evil. A theodicy in this more precise or specialized sense is an exercise in formulating an account of God's possible and or actual reasons for permitting evil. Theodicy is an account of God's possible and or actual reasons for permitting evil. It is a listing of the goods that morally justify God's permission of individual evils. This is theodicy. Now notice I say it's an account of God's possible and or actual reasons for permitting evil that would justify His permission of evil. What do I mean by possible? I mean that we can think of purposes that God would have that would be so good that these purposes would justify His permission of evil if those were His purposes, if those were His reasons. But we aren't committing ourselves to the actual existence of those reasons. We're not saying that we know that those are His purposes. Right? We're simply saying that these are purposes God could have for permitting evil. And if He had those purposes, then He would be justified in permitting those evils. And it could be a plurality of things. It doesn't have to be just one sort of thing that could function as a morally justifying reason for permitting evil. But the point in claiming that it's a possible reason for permitting evil is that we don't have to claim that we know this is God's actual reason. On the other hand, if a theodicy takes the form of an account of God's actual reasons for permitting evil, that's more ambitious. Now the claim is, these are the sorts of things that actually do justify God's permission of evil. Then the question becomes, well, now how do you know that those are God's reasons? It could be based on revelation. You'd have to have an argument for that. But as a matter of fact, I do think that the Bible, as a deposit of revelation from God, does include an account of some of the kinds of reasons God has for permitting evils. And I'll mention a couple of these in a moment. But understand, first of all, the general character of this type of reply to the evidential argument from evil. Now, what this particular reply does is it says, look, even those evils that look so curious in character, that make it seem so unlikely that God exists, could have justifying reasons within the will of God. And we don't even have to know what they are. Or maybe we can actually think of goods that God could produce as a result of permitting the evil of this kind or permitting this much evil. Now let's talk about both the proliferation and the character of evil, both the quantity of evil and the quality of evil that we've talked about in connection with the evidential form of the argument. Let's take quantity. Does the atheist know how much of the evil that is real could be avoided without compromising God's good purposes